Welcome to the Deal by Me podcast, where we ask guests to tell us your story and we put the spotlight on you. Hello there, this is Dr. James W. Smith, your host. We transform lives by encouraging and inspiring. Someone encouraged and inspired this host, a former lawyer, gambler, inmate, and his life was transformed, and he is now a retired pastor and currently a podcaster. The same can happen to you. Check out my website and see what I offer that can be encouraging, inspiring, and transforming for you. It may be a book or a virtual consultation. And while at the website, get a t shirt or cap that says encouraging, inspiring, and transforming. I'm available for speaking engagements, in person, and virtual seminars. Please contact me through my website, www.dealbyme.com. I have with me today Amanda Blackwood, who finally managed to get away from the man who was trafficking her. She was 31 years old and didn't know what she had gone through, much less how to deal with the pain of feeling like a broken person, unworthy of love and filled with so much anger. It is a thrill and a real privilege to have her come and share her story with listeners of this podcast. Amanda, it is so good to have you come and share with us today. I would like for you to first just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you are being interviewed from, and then we will get into a good conversation, question and answer period, I like to put it, and we will just move this along. So if you will tell us a little bit about yourself in as brief as you possibly can, and then we'll get into a good discussion.
I currently live in Denver, Colorado with my amazing husband of 1.5 years, our 6 rescue cats, and we are expecting our first grandchild soon.
Okay. All right. Now, having um, heard you say that, I know from your profile that you have actually um, had a tremendous life experience, one that involves human trafficking. Um, so, could you tell our listeners of this podcast uh, what are some of the most popular myths about human trafficking? What do folks think when they hear about it, or the myths as it relates to it? Can you kind of share that with us a little bit, if you don't mind?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the first questions I usually get whenever somebody asks me, whenever I tell somebody that I'm a survivor of human trafficking, the first thing they ask me is, "Oh my gosh, how old were you?" That's
Okay.
because the common misconception is that human trafficking only happens to minors. It's usually people believe that it happens with total strangers in windowless vans grabbing kids off of the streets and kidnapping them.
Mm.
The reality of human trafficking is that only 1/4 of all victims are under the age of 18. I was trafficked 3 different times in my life. The average number of somebody to be trafficked is 7 times. So again, I was very blessed to only have to go through this 3 times. Um, the the truth behind who it is that does the trafficking, more than 85% of all victims of trafficking are trafficked by people they know and trust and love, people that have authority in their lives. A lot of times this is parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, boyfriends and girlfriends, those kinds of authoritative relationships in their lives. This is a very big misconception. It's one of the things that a lot of survivors are out here trying to fight, is because people like me, I didn't know that what I went through had a name until I went to a seminar and had it explained to me by an FBI agent standing on a stage about what human trafficking actually looks like and who the perpetrators are. I thought that since I wasn't an underage kid, there's no way that what I went through was called human trafficking. and I was wrong.
Mm, mm. Well, could you explain to listeners of this podcast, because I'm excited about the, the the topic that we're exploring today, because I be honest with you, I've never explored this topic with anyone before, so I know listeners are going to be very intrigued by your story. So could you kind of tell us your definition of human trafficking? What goes on?
That is another very good question. There's a lot of crossover and miscommunication when it comes to human trafficking. So, according to the Department of Homeland Security, human trafficking is defined as the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain sex or labor acts from another person. But if you were to Google the definition, it would include the terminology of transportation. When in reality, if you Google trafficking, as in trafficking drugs, it is the sale of an illegal substance. Trafficking of drugs has nothing to do with taking it across state lines or across international borders. So when you really start breaking it down, human trafficking is just the sale of a human being from one to another for labor, for sex acts, for the rest of their life as slave labor. Has nothing to do with transportation. When you start talking about transporting humans, that's when you start talking about human smuggling. And while there are a lot of overlaps between the two, they exist completely separately. They are separate issues that need to both be addressed.
Okay, that's really something very interesting to know. But let me ask you. You talk about the different times, so that means does that mean you are in human trafficking at one point? Did you get out and then you find yourself back into it again? And if so, how many times were you involved in this type of human trafficking?
I was trafficked 3 distinct and completely separate times. One time when I was 18 years old. This was in Arizona. I left Arizona shortly afterward because I knew what I'd been through was terrible and I needed to get away from there. And having grown up in the abusive situations that I did, I was constantly seeking out situations that would mimic those that I grew up in, because the people that hurt me were the people who loved me. And if one existed without the other, then neither one was true. So, in my continuing to move around, I found myself in Florida. My family basically left me on the side of the road in Florida and said, "You're on your own, fend for yourself." I ended up being picked up by a young couple who told me that they would give me a place to stay until I got on my feet, when really what they meant was they were going to give me a place to stay until they sold me to the highest bidder, because that's what happened. I
Hmm.
was locked up for 23 and a half hours in a small room with no food, no water, no bathroom facilities of any kind. And when I got out of there again, I ran. I needed to get as far away from all of this as possible. I floated around for a long time trying to figure out what to do with my life and how I was going to exist. I had already been through so much at that point. I was molested at 4, again at 12, again at 13, again at 15, raped at 17. The 2 trafficking incidences that happened were at 18, at 19. And I was looking for a place of safety. I was looking for a sense of identity. I was looking for anything and everything that I could find any place except for God. I was angry at God because all of this stuff had happened to me and I didn't know how to reconcile this. Things weren't adding up in my brain. I was broken. I met a police officer when I was in my 20s. He was a police officer in Scotland, and we continued to communicate long distance for many years, 7 years. Through all of this communication, I watched his little girl grow up into a lovely teenager, um, got to know his entire family, watched his relationships as they grew and fell apart. And we always came back to each other in the end. And after 7 years, he asked me to get a fiancé visa and move over to Scotland to go and be with him. He knew about my past. He knew that I'd been through a lot, and he wanted to give me a sense of safety and security, he said. So I left my career, sold my car, got rid of my apartment, and flew to Scotland on a fiance visa to go and be with him. And it took 7 years to get me there. And once I was there, it took him 7 days to start trafficking me.
Hmm.
So all three of these incidences are completely unrelated with no ties to one another except for me and who I was inside. As long as I continued to remain this broken person that was looking for love and acceptance wherever I could get it, except from where I needed it most, I wasn't going to be able to change my situation. So trafficking, most people do end up back in it an average of seven times. And that's because of that same cycle that we have. We're constantly seeking out these familiar types. As long as we continue to seek out these familiar types, just because of the sense of familiarity, we are going to continue to be put in these horrible situations that we shouldn't ever be put in.
Whew, I'm about speechless. I must be honest with you. Your story is just so awesome until it's just hard to fathom a lot that you're saying, and most people don't know a lot about you know uh, human trafficking.
Mhm.
So let me ask you, kind of, how long does it take, for this trauma? Obviously, you went through it three different times, you know, uh, as a trauma survivor to kind of get back to a normal life. And I would assume you bet you're there now, but how long does it basically take for this to happen?
That question is the exact same question that I stood up to ask at a conference in 2018. I was at this anti-trafficking conference, and I remember sitting there, and I had just learned the definition of trafficking, and they opened the floor up to questions to the panelists, and I raised my hand, and they brought over the microphone to me. And what was supposed to come out of my mouth was, "How long does it take?" And what came out of
Mhm.
my mouth instead, for the first time ever, was, "I'm a survivor." And once I got those words out, then I could finally ask what I needed to ask. How long does it take for somebody who's been through this to have a normal life?
Mm.
There were 5 panelists up there, and they tried to answer as best they could. But the consensus generally was that it's different for every single person, exactly as trafficking is different for every single person. The abuses we go through, the traumas that we experience are different for every single person. Our brains build neurosynapses to be able to cope with what it is that we've been through. And retraining our brains, depending on how many neurosynapses there are, depending on how much trauma there is, can be a lifelong event. And while I seem to have everything completely put together, what a lot of people don't realize is that trauma survivors develop these autoimmune disorders. I'm currently battling Crohn's disease, chronic hives, and thyroid disease. So while I can walk down the street and look like I have a perfectly normal life, and I do have a very happy life now, very functional and joyful with my
Mhm.
husband and with our community and our church and everything that I'm doing, there will never be a sense of normal in my life again. That was taken
Okay,
away from me when I was 4.
I got you. And I do understand what you're saying. We go through so much and we hear so much about this, and most people just don't know uh, much about it except for what we hear, law enforcement and what
Mhm.
have you. Uh, so if somebody is interested in getting involved with this fight against human trafficking, and yeah, I never know exactly who the listeners are that's listening to this podcast, but somebody might be interested in and say, how can I, you know, get involved with this? What are some of the things that you might say to them or will say to them?
I would highly encourage them to vet the organizations that they look up and decide they want to work with. There are several
Okay.
well-known organizations. Some of those organizations are wonderful, some of them are not. There's one in particular that will take the survivor's story and use it for their own monetary gains. And they say it's so that they can afford to send out the next mission, when the founder of this organization is living in a multi-million-dollar mansion in San Diego, California.
Okay.
That's very important to know, is to
Hmm.
look up these organizations, find out where the money's going, figure out who they are, where they come from, why are they involved. One of the best organizations out there that somebody can get involved with is called Alight. Alight is an
Okay.
organization that offers legal services to survivors of human trafficking. When I found out that my former trafficker had made me famous by putting photos and videos of me in these situations all over different pornography websites and was making a lot of money off of me, I had a bit of a breakdown. Through an anti trafficking organization out here in Colorado, they connected me to Alight, and Alight was able to help me get the legal help that I needed to get all this stuff pulled down off of the internet. There's also a lot of organizations out there that are willing to pay for counseling and therapy sessions for people, and I went through a lot of that also. Without that, I wouldn't be where I am today. These are the kind of services that we need: boots on the ground. We need people that are willing to go into the trenches and do this dirty work and do this hard work. And if you work with an organization that you can't see where they're physically doing this work, don't work with them anymore. Find somebody who's willing to do the work.
I was looking at your profile and just what you said. I assume that's probably the reason you said this. And I kind of quoted, you said, please do not approach me regarding pay to participate podcasts. It's considered further exploitation to take a trafficking survivor's story and use it for others' personal gains. Is that where you were coming from when you just said watch out for the different organizations?
Yes, that's a
Okay.
huge red flag. If somebody is willing to take a survivor's story and use it for their own personal gains, that survivor's not getting anything out of it. All they're getting is they're being used, essentially.
Okay.
I'm big against that. And I wasn't for a long time. I was willing to speak up and speak out because I had a voice and this stuff needed to be heard. But if people are going to ask me to pay to be able to tell my story, that's absolutely exploitation. That's not
I got it.
okay.
I understand exactly where you are. I hear that. I hear it. Um, Amanda, my podcast is about encouraging, inspiring, and transforming. And of course, I think you already know that. Uh, uh, Listeners may not know this, but and they may already know it. But you had a chance to interview me, and I'm privileged to get a chance to interview you. So what I want to ask you is this: if there is somebody out there who is maybe in the same situation that you've been in, or just maybe going through something. It doesn't necessarily might not be this. Could have down moments, depressed, or whatever it is, and they need encouraging, they need inspiring, and in many ways need transforming. What would you say to them?
It's never too late and it's never impossible. I'm currently working on, I have two different podcasts. I have a book series going called the Growth from Darkness podcast. The book series is called the Growth from Darkness book series. Uh, it explores what the stages of trauma are, as well as the second book talks about the trauma reactions, what the long-term consequences are of not dealing with them, and how to fight back against them to have a better life. There's going to be other volumes too. The next one is going to be healthy boundaries, and the next one is about how to support survivors. In these books, the whole reason that I wrote them is because this is how I managed to come through to the other side. You can transform your life. You can absolutely encourage and inspire yourself to get through it. I would urge anybody out there to go and find a church where they feel like they have a sense of comfort and a sense of belonging. It doesn't matter what you dress like when you show up. You show up as you are, you might not leave the same. That's important to recognize. Churches aren't expecting you to show up in dresses and high heels and perfectly aligned with life already. Churches are filled with broken people. That's why they exist. That's why we go. It's because we
Mm,
need this. And they need you every bit as much as you need them. I've learned that the hard way too.
I'm a retired pastor, and Amanda, you are speaking to me, just touching me today because I know just how true what you're saying is, and it's just good to hear somebody expound on that and to talk about it. Listeners, just hang on, don't go any place because Amanda is still going to share some more good information with us. But I want to first ask Amanda if somebody's interested in learning more about you, or human trafficking, about your books, or any other uh, good information that they may want to find out about you, how would they go about doing it?
I have a couple of different websites. My primary website right now is growthfromdarkness.com. It goes along with the book series and the podcast and all that. I also have another website that goes into more details about who I am as a person rather than these projects I'm working on. That one is detailedpieces.com. All of my books are available through Barnes and Noble, and this includes audiobooks, paperbacks, and e-readers. I do have some of those books also available through my Etsy shop. They can always reach out to me through Facebook for more information, which is facebook.com/Amanda Blackwood Survivor. I'm also on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok as at Detailed Pieces. I'm all over the place.
Wow, beautiful. Well said. As we start bringing this to a conclusion, tell listeners of this podcast what helped you to heal from your trauma and whether it is possible to have a healthy relationship after surviving the trauma that you went through human trafficking.
I got to say, probably one of the biggest helps to me was hitting rock bottom. And I
Okay.
think there's a lot of people out there who can absolutely identify with that. During one of the darkest parts of my trafficking, I had decided while I was in Scotland that I was going to end my life. That was my lowest point. I went down to an old church that had been built in the early 1700s, and I sat in the graveyard and I talked to the only friend I had who was 6 feet under me at the time.
Hmm.
His headstone, I'm assuming it was a man, was dated 1776. After a while, I realized that really the whole reason I was there and talking to this unknown person, this invisible person, was because I felt just as unknown and invisible as he did.
Hmm.
I kept on praying that somebody was going to show up, and nobody did. So I got up and I sat on the church steps for a while. And again, I prayed that somebody would show up, and nobody did. Finally, I got up and I went to the train station. And at the time, I was a smoker, and I had one cigarette and a book of 3 matches with me. As I was smoking my last cigarette, a man came out onto the platform and he asked me for a light, and I handed him my book of matches. And he lit his cigarette and he tried to hand them back to me, and I said, I won't need them again. I wanted him to understand. But who was I to tell this man? Who was I to whine to somebody that I was about to end my life? I didn't know this man. He didn't know me. But if he had asked me, I would have answered. But he didn't.
Hmm.
And when he handed back my matches and insisted that I take them back, a little boy came out onto the platform and he grabbed his father's hand. And this little boy looked up at me, and he looked at me with eyes of wisdom. He looked at me with the eyes not of a child, but of God. And he looked right through me. That day, I went back to what was my prison at the time, thanking God for something that hadn't even happened yet. It really was one of my darkest moments, but I knew that if God was going to keep me alive by having this child be the one person who could see me that day,
Hmm.
that he had more in store for me, and my story wasn't done yet. What helped me the most was my belief in God and my understanding that just because I'm living through something that is an absolute nightmare doesn't mean that that's all my life is ever meant to be.
I, I'm speechless, Amanda. I'm speechless. I'll be very honest with you. Your story is just breathtaking. Uh,
Thank you.
what's one thing you wish you could tell someone who is going through what you went through? If if you just had one thing you could tell them, what would that be?
You are stronger and smarter than you may ever believe you are.
Hmm.
I got out of there because I put some pieces together and I did some studies and some research into psychology. If you know how to do it, if you can do this research, if you have these tools at your fingertips, fight and fight hard and know that there are people out there who are called exit strategists who can help you to exit from these situations. They are out there. Not knowing that you have options is the exact same thing as not having options. Find those options, find your path, and listen to God. He will get you out of there if you give him enough of a chance.
Tell us, how do you celebrate your wins? Because obviously you've had some in your life to just been where you are, where you have been, and to be where you are now. Are big wins. How do you celebrate it?
One of my favorite things to do is to cook a fancy meal I've never made before. So I have a cookbook coming out on June 1st. I'm very excited about. It's called Surviving in the Kitchen: Recipes for Life, Love, and a Full Stomach. And recently, within the last year, I learned how to make one of the best steaks I've ever had in my life. I don't even go to restaurants anymore. Probably going to make one of those for Mother's Day. I
Okay.
love to celebrate with my husband by sitting down and watching a good movie or going out for a walk or any number of things. I might just stand in my living room and go, wee, and just do a little jig. I might be completely goofy or I might take the day off. You never know. But it's so important to take the time to do these things and to find some way to celebrate every little thing in your life because at this point, I'm still alive. That's enough to celebrate.
I love your story. I love your story. What's one thing you love about yourself that is not based on your physical appearance? What's tell us one thing because your story is just so amazing.
I've often been described as tenacious. I think my
Okay.
tenacity is probably my favorite thing about myself. I didn't give up. It would have
Okay.
been easy to give up, and I never figured that out.
Hmm. Wow. Wow. Well, listeners, there you have it. Amanda Blackwood, who has spoken on in multiple stages, being in view by the Chicago Tribune, sold her art all over the country. She's been a keynote speaker at international summits, loaned her voice to multiple radio programs, and published over a dozen books. You've got to listen to this amazing story from Amanda Blackwood. She is awesome. She is awesome. And I am thrilled and amazed to have had her share her story with us today. Amanda, thank you so very much.
And thank you for having me.